Welcome to the first episode of the PlayStation Experiment, a chrono gaming series covering the Sony PlayStation and the history of the 5th generation of consoles. The goal of this series is to explore one of the most remarkable, tumultuous, and important periods in video game history, primarily through a chronological review of every release for the most successful platform of the era, the Sony PlayStation. The Sony PlayStation was more than the massive commercial success that launched the brand that dominates gaming to this day. It was also one of the most important video game consoles of all time. The Atari VCS effectively created the home console industry, taking the spark of inspiration of the Fairchild Channel F and turning it into a vibrant video game platform. Nintendo's Famicom turned video game consoles into a worldwide phenomenon, and expanded the possibilities of console games as narrative-driven adventures that balanced exploration with action. The PlayStation is the birth of the modern video game industry. It fully broke through the conception of home video game consoles as toys, and established them as consumer electronic staples that are as much a part of the living room as the television set. It expanded the concept of what could constitute a video game in the minds of even non-gamers, leading the way towards a world in which a multi-billion-dollar video game industry can encompass AAA blockbusters and non-violent art games. The PlayStation was a huge gamble for Sony. We all know how it would turn out now, but it was hardly a guaranteed success at the start. That's why the series is called the PlayStation Experiment, because the PlayStation truly was an experiment, as were many of its games. This series aims to cover the games that we all remember from the PlayStation, the enduring hits like Final Fantasy VII and Crash Bandicoot, but its real heart lies in the weird, the wild, the wonderful, the evolutionary dead ends that nonetheless boldly embodied the spirit of this era when technology rapidly advanced and genre conventions weren't yet fully established. The 5th generation of consoles was also an era when many companies threw their hat in the ring with their own video game consoles. Nintendo and Sega put up a fierce fight against the PlayStation, but other established players such as NEC and Atari also released consoles, alongside new upstarts such as the 3DO Company, and computer manufacturers such as Commodore and Fujitsu releasing consoleized versions of their computer platform. While this series is focused on the Sony PlayStation, it would be an incomplete portrait of the era to not also look at the wider landscape. This series will include segments covering the PlayStation's two major competitors, the Nintendo 64 and the Sega Saturn, as well as minor console players and the worlds of arcade and computer games. Additional segments will cover other aspects of this era, from important developers to marketing campaigns, the game magazines, and the first wave of video games journalism on the web. These segments will be interwoven with game reviews. Every commercially released PlayStation title will be covered. This includes all games released in America, Japan, Europe, and elsewhere. The length of reviews will vary greatly. Many games will receive in-depth analysis, but because of the enormity of the PlayStation library, some games will be grouped into quick roundups. For instance, there are several budget series of pachinko and pachi slot games that do not have much variation besides offering recreations of various tables and machines. Each episode will cover a variable number of games. In order to make these fairly reasonable to produce, each episode will be around an hour in length, although exceptions will be made, such as the case of the special debut episode covering the complete Japanese launch lineup. Now that we've got all that out of the way, let's travel back in time a little bit before the PlayStation's launch to set the stage for its debut.
He's back. All you had to do was ask. Super Mario Bros. 3 from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power.
Consumers buck, even though there's never been much of a contest out there. Nintendo has been the hottest, best-selling toy.
The video game industry in the first half of the 1990s was a goddamn mess. After a tumultuous 1980s in which a veritable smorgasbord of microcomputer and console platforms duked it out, a handful of winners and losers had emerged. Nintendo, having conquered the nascent Japanese console gaming market with the Famicom, then revived the moribund American console gaming market when it brought the Famicom over as the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985. By 1990, Nintendo claimed to hold a 93% share of the video game market. For most folks, Nintendo was synonymous with video games. Nintendo's three main rivals in the console market, Atari, Sega, and NEC, had limited success at best. Atari limped along with its 2600 and the 7800, an 8-bit console that was shelved prior to the NES's success, then was dusted off and presented as a competitor. Sega's 8-bit Master System eventually found an audience in Europe, but it was relegated to also-ran status elsewhere. Its new 16-bit Genesis showed promise, but hadn't yet made significant headway against Nintendo's dominance. NEC and Hudson Soft's PC Engine was a success in Japan, but floundered in its American release as a TurboGrafx 16, and was virtually a non-entity in Europe and elsewhere outside a hardcore importer market. And yet, Nintendo's dominance in the video game industry was already slowly starting to crumble. The Famicom hardware was beginning to show its age, and its successor, the Super Famicom, limped out of the gate with a Japanese release at the end of 1990 with just a handful of games, then finally saw an American release as the SNES in August 1991. The third-party developers that were the lifeblood of the Famicom and NES were also tiring of Nintendo's excessively controlling policies, which limited how many games they could publish and demanded exclusivity. But then, two seismic shifts would shake Nintendo's iron grip on the industry.
Genesis does.
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis Genesis.
The one that was most apparent at the time was Sega's rise to become a serious player in the console market. Sega was an arcade powerhouse in the 1980s that struggled to translate its strengths to console games, but somewhere around 1990, it cracked the code. Genesis games like Revenge of Shinobi and Castle of Illusion gave Nintendo a run for its money while defining a uniquely Sega style. This culminated in 1991's Sonic the Hedgehog, an enduring classic that defines Sega to this day. The hiring of Tom Kalinske as Sega of America's CEO in 1990 finally gave the Sega Genesis and its growing game library the competitive edge it needed to build a wider audience in North America. The Genesis consistently outsold the SNES in North America for much of the 16-bit generation. In other parts of the world, where it was known as the Mega Drive, it also found greater success. In Europe, the Mega Drive was the dominant console of the early 1990s, and even the Master System experienced a small renaissance. The Mega Drive was a more muted success in Japan, trailing the PC Engine and Super Famicom, but it was considerably more successful than the Mark III, the Japanese version of the Master System. The second shift was less commercially successful at the time, but would prove to be far more important in the long run. On December 4th, 1988, NEC released the CD-ROM expansion for the PC Engine, along with the first two CD-ROM console video games. A port of Capcom's arcade game Street Fighter, renamed as Fighting Street, and Noriko, a flimsy adventure game featuring Japanese pop idol Noriko Ogawa. The CD-ROM had been around for a few years before the release of the CD-ROM, having first been announced in 1984. But up until then, it was a format with limited commercial application. If you purchased a very expensive and very slow CD-ROM drive for your computer in the 1980s, you could enjoy releases such as the Grolier Academic Encyclopedia and a multi-disc set containing the Yellow Pages for the entire United States. But the CD-ROM demonstrated a far more exciting use of the CD-ROM, as a mass storage format for video games. The CD-ROM itself was a modest success, limited by its high price and the PC Engine's lack of success outside of Japan. NEC further enhanced the CD-ROM in December 1991 with the Super CD-ROM, and in March 1994, late in the system's life, with the Arcade CD-ROM. It also released several variants under the Duo line that combined the PC Engine's HuCard with a built-in CD-ROM attachment. But the improvements to the format were limited to expanding the system's memory, and the PC Engine's 1987 hardware showed its age by the mid-90s, despite some impressive games like the Castlevania series highlight, Rondo of Blood, and ports of Neo Geo fighting games such as Fatal Fury Special, which leveraged the massive 2 MB of the arcade CD-ROM standard. The attachment was released in America in 1989 as the Turbo CD. Glowing reviews praised the groundbreaking Ys Book 1 and 2, a Hudson Soft developed port of the first two games in Falcom's popular action RPG series, with a Red Book audio soundtrack and voiced cutscenes. But as far as sales went, it was a dud. Only 45 titles were released for the Turbo CD in America, out of a little under 400 titles in total produced worldwide. Despite the CD-ROM's niche status, it was clear that CD-ROMs were the future of home video games. Cartridges were expensive and limited in capacity, and even floppy disks held a fraction of the data that could fit onto a CD-ROM. As home video games became more complex and immersive, there was a demand for games that could deliver longer gameplay experiences with higher quality audio visuals and cinematic presentation. The CD-ROM could do all of that at a cost much cheaper than a cartridge. Sega soon developed its own CD-ROM add-on. The Mega CD, known as the Sega CD in America, was released in Japan on December 12, 1991, then followed in 1992 in North America and 1993 in Europe. Unlike the CD-ROM, the Sega CD had extensive extra hardware besides additional RAM. Perhaps in an attempt to counter some of the SNES's hardware advantages, such as its Mode 7 background plane and sample-based audio hardware, the Sega CD contains hardware sprite scaling and rotation, a PCM audio chip, and a faster Motorola 68000 CPU. Despite several highly regarded games such as Sonic CD and the Lunar JRPGs, the Sega CD is widely regarded as a failure, selling slightly over 2 million units worldwide and having a library of a little over 200 titles. Nintendo also had big plans for a CD-ROM attachment for the SNES. After a talented engineer at Sony, Ken Kutaragi, helped Nintendo create the SNES sound chip, Sony and Nintendo entered a partnership to create an SNES CD-ROM that would be released as both an SNES add-on and as a standalone Sony-branded game console that could play SNES cartridges and CD-ROMs. Of course, this partnership was fated to sour quickly, and Nintendo would instead partner with Philips, another consumer electronics giant, on an SNES CD-ROM attachment. That deal would also prove to be ill-fated. No CD-ROM attachment was ever released for the SNES, but the acrimonious split between Sony and Nintendo would alter the course of gaming history. We'll get back to that in a little bit. The other two major segments of gaming beyond consoles at the time were arcades and computers. While arcades were diminishing in importance from their 80s heyday, they were still producing massive hits. Beat-em-ups like Capcom's Final Fight and Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles dominated the early 90s. But Street Fighter II's release in 1991 heralded a shift towards one-on-one fighters. Console gamers demanded home ports of these arcade hits, and for the most part, game developers delivered. The 16-bit consoles didn't quite have the horsepower to pull off perfect ports of games like Street Fighter II, but in the hands of a competent developer, they could deliver a reasonable simulacrum. Sure, Street Fighter II on the SNES is obviously not 100% accurate to the arcade when you compare them side by side, but if it's 1992 and you've only seen the original Street Fighter II on the handful of occasions you went to an arcade, you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference. The unique thing about arcades at the time, though, is that they could cost a lot more than even cutting-edge home game consoles. In the early 90s, the several $1,000s that a premium arcade cabinet could command could buy processing power that was a generational leap over 16-bit home consoles. The Sega Genesis ran on a single Motorola 68000 CPU clocked at 7.6 MHz, but Sega's System Y board, which powered visually stunning games like Galaxy Force 2 and Power Drift, ran on a whopping 3 68000s clocked at 12.5 MHz, along with custom graphics hardware. While some home ports were attempted, they were often laughably cut down and lost the appeal of the arcade originals. An arms race developed in the 1990s as arcade game manufacturers tried to one-up each other with more impressive hardware. Two Japanese arcade giants, Namco and Sega, were at the forefront. While Sega was pushing sprite-based games to the limit with the System Y and System 32, Namco started experimenting with polygonal graphics with 1988's Winning Run. Running on Namco's ridiculously complicated System 21 hardware, Winning Run was a racing game in the vein of Pole Position, featuring simple but effective flat-shaded polygons. At the time, Winning Run was novel, but it actually looks quite a bit worse than Sega's sprite-based racing games like Power Drift. Namco produced several more System 21 games through the early 90s, and Atari also produced some polygonal arcade games around the same time, such as Hard Drivin' and Stun Runner. These Atari games occasionally even received home ports, with Hard Drivin' hitting the Genesis and most of the popular computer platforms of the time. But the ports were typically awful, and polygonal arcade games were still often treated as amusement ride novelties rather than serious video games. This dismissive attitude towards polygonal games began to change when Sega debuted its Model 1 hardware with Virtua Racing in 1992. While Virtua Racing was strictly limited to flat-shaded polygons much like Namco and Atari's previous games, it's a much more refined experience. The cars and tracks are far more detailed, with charming touches like the amusement park in the final bend of the beginner course. The music cues and announcer voice pop with trademark Sega pizzazz. The action is smooth and the controls feel just right. Virtua Racing was a massive hit, and a turning point in the games industry towards a polygonal future. On the computer side, the myriad 8 and 16-bit microcomputers of the 1980s were beginning their long decline, as the industry began to standardize on PC compatibles running MS-DOS. While initially lacking in audiovisual capabilities relative to competitors like the Commodore Amiga, PC compatibles started to compete with, and then exceed their competition, with advances like VGA graphics and the AdLib sound card arriving in the late 80s and becoming standard in just a few short years. Combined with the ubiquity of PC compatibles as work machines, they quickly became the computer gaming platform of choice. While some of the cheaper microcomputers of the 1980s, such as the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum, were sold primarily as game machines to a younger crowd, especially in Europe, by the early 1990s, PC gaming was associated with older, more affluent gamers. More cerebral experiences, such as hardcore RPGs like Ultima, and turn-based simulation games like Sid Meier's Civilization were popular, along with narrative and puzzle-driven graphical adventure games like King's Quest and The Secret of Monkey Island. But as a new school of younger game designers, influenced by arcade and console games, started making PC games, they merged these design sensibilities together to create games that took the best from both worlds. An early exemplar of this approach is 1990's Wing Commander. At its core, Wing Commander is a spaceflight sim, but it boils the action down to just the essentials, crafting a game that's accessible even to the most trigger-happy console gamer. It then marries this to a pulpy sci-fi narrative filled with memorable characters, for an experience that feels cinematic even though it's mostly just talking heads with limited animation. More PC games in the early 90s made moves towards more accessible gameplay styles and compelling narratives. Dune 2 pioneered the real-time strategy genre and set it against the universe of the Dune novels, a far cry from SSI's dry, historical turn-based strategy games. Early shareware developers like Apogee, id, and Epic created 2D platformers like Commander Keen and Jill of the Jungle. As PCs grew more powerful, developers started to go far beyond anything possible in consoles. In 1992, two major titles debuted on PCs that would go on to change gaming. The first, id's Wolfenstein 3D, was a straightforward run-and-gun action game with a twist. It was played from the first-person perspective, powered by a simple but effective raycasting engine that produced 3D visuals that were unparalleled for their time. The second, Blue Sky Productions' Ultima Underworld, was also played from a first-person perspective and used 3D graphics. But unlike Wolfenstein 3D with its guns-blazing action, it was an RPG that mixed real-time combat and dungeon crawling. PC technology was advancing so rapidly at this point that around 18 months after id released Wolfenstein 3D, it unleashed a game that was a generational leap forward, Doom. At this point, there was no denying that PCs were at the vanguard of gaming. While the SNES, with the aid of the SuperFX GSS2 enhancement chip, managed a playable but heavily compromised port of Doom, it was clear that the current crop of consoles couldn't keep up. But even a modest gaming PC at the time was many times more expensive than a console, limiting the audience of PC-exclusive games.
If you're not playing on a 3DO system, what are you playing with? Presenting 3DO, the most advanced home gaming system in the universe. It's time to put away your toys.
Starting at the end of 1993, a new generation of consoles began to arrive. In October, the Panasonic FZ1 Real 3DO Interactive Multiplayer hit store shelves with the platform's only launch game, Crash and Burn, packed in. The 3DO platform was a standard developed by Dave Needle and RJ Michael, and managed by Electronic Arts founder Trip Hawkins' 3DO company. The 3DO was built around a 32-bit ARM CPU, a dual-speed CD-ROM drive, and custom sound and graphics hardware far beyond 16-bit consoles. Around a month later, the Atari Jaguar was unleashed on the world by Atari Corporation, a company composed of the last remnants of Atari's consumer electronics divisions. Atari Corporation had managed to eke out an existence after the video game crash of the early 1980s through its modestly successful computers, such as the 16-bit Atari ST and the last of its once popular 8-bit machines, while continuing to make a half-hearted effort at maintaining a foothold in the gaming market. The 2600 and 7800 consoles limped along as budget options, while the handheld Lynx struggled against Nintendo's Game Boy despite vastly superior hardware. The Jaguar was touted as a 64-bit monster, but was quickly revealed to be closer to a 16-bit console with a slew of custom chips that were powerful, but difficult for developers to harness.
Enough? With the Atari Jaguar system's 64 bits, 3D graphics, and CD quality sound, how can you be satisfied with good enough?
While neither console set the world on fire during the 1993 holiday season, their releases signaled the start of what might be the most tumultuous 2-year period in game history. Under heavy pressure after facing criticism for censoring the SNES port of the massive arcade hit Mortal Kombat, Nintendo shed its squeaky clean image and entered its Play It Loud era, with an edgy new ad campaign that featured the Butthole Surfer song Who Was in My Room Last Night, and imbued even cuddly characters like Yoshi and Kirby with dangerous amounts of tube. While Nintendo was working on a new console, then known to the public as Project Reality, it staved off more powerful competitors through the clever use of pre-rendered 3D graphics in games such as Donkey Kong Country and Super Mario RPG. The SNES continued to enjoy success during this era, but Nintendo stumbled with its 32-bit Virtual Boy debacle, as well as continual delays of the console that would eventually be known as the Nintendo 64. Meanwhile, Sega, already overextended in supporting the Genesis, Sega CD, and handheld Game Gear, would embark on 2 ambitious next-gen projects. The first, the 32X, was expansion hardware for the Genesis that added 2 SH2 32-bit processors and extra RAM, resulting in a system that could display far more colors than the Genesis and even push a decent amount of polygons for its day. The second, the Saturn, was the true 32-bit successor to the Genesis, a standalone CD-ROM based console originally designed as a 2D powerhouse with enough 3D power to handle Sega's Model 1 arcade games, but hastily redesigned to bring its 3D capabilities into line with the competition. Both projects were heavily hyped in game magazines, but it was clear that Sega was struggling to define itself after the success of the Genesis. The next-gen fight began to really heat up in 1994, and the rumors and speculations spread through game magazines included whispers of any number of companies readying new hardware. From toy companies to established gaming players like SNK, there was no lack of competitors rushing to be the name behind the next big thing. While the 16-bit wars had been heated, this was something different. The resilience of games as a medium even after the crash of around a decade prior had made it clear that there was a real market for game consoles that was here to stay. At the same time, the audience that was growing up with games was demanding more sophisticated gaming experiences, and gamers were increasingly adults with disposable income that they were glad to spend on more powerful gaming devices. Gaming had arrived, and now all that was needed was an accessible gaming platform that got it right. When Sony announced that it was working on a 32-bit console around the beginning of 1994, it wasn't immediately clear that it would, in just a few short years, become that platform. Electronic Gaming Monthly, the preeminent American game magazine of the time, gave more space to NEC's announcement of the 32-bit system that would become the PCFX than Sony's machine. But Sony had learned a lot from working on building a system with Nintendo. While that system, which never got past the prototype stage, was essentially just a CD-ROM and some extra RAM attached to an SNES, this new console was a 32-bit monster with hardware support for rendering polygons. Taking a cue from the old SNES CD-ROM prototype, colloquially referred to as the Nintendo PlayStation, Sony named its new console the PlayStation X, or PSX for short. By the time it launched, the X had been dropped, and the Sony PlayStation was born. Hype around the PlayStation grew during 1994, as it became clear that it would be a major player in the console space. Namco came on board as a close partner, and screenshots of the PlayStation port of its arcade hit Ridge Racer blew away anything that had been seen on consoles before. Tamsoft's Battle Arena Toshinden became a top contender to take Virtua Fighter's 3D fighting game crown, and its texture-mapped characters and fully 3D arena backgrounds made jaws drop. Game magazines took notice. The Sony PlayStation looked fucking sick. By the end of 1994, when the PlayStation and Saturn launched in Japan less than 2 weeks apart, the PlayStation had risen in stature to the point that it was seen as the toughest competition for Sega's 32-bit machine. The Saturn launched first, on November 22nd, and it immediately sold out its initial shipment of 200,000 units the same day, largely on the strength of a port of the wildly popular Virtua Fighter. The PlayStation only mustered 100,000 units on its first day, but that still exceeded expectations for a new player in the console market. In the following months, positive buzz and a steady trickle of well-received releases bolstered PlayStation sales, while Sega scrambled to shore up its anemic Saturn lineup. The 32-bit console wars were now fully underway. Ridge Racer was the shining star of the PlayStation's Japanese launch lineup. Nearly every magazine at the time raved about its groundbreaking graphics, fine-tuned gameplay, and killer soundtrack. Nick Rocks of GameFan concluded that, never before have you witnessed, heard, or played a game this spectacular. Next Generation called Ridge Racer the killer app that Namco and Sony can be proud of. So you'd be forgiven if you are underwhelmed booting up Ridge Racer to find that it consists of a single racetrack, with a few basic variants and difficulty levels, along with a choice of 4 cars. And without a doubt, Ridge Racer is a thin game no matter how you slice it, something that's even noted by many reviewers at the time of its release. Yet Ridge Racer persists as an icon of the early PlayStation. To get to the bottom of why Ridge Racer is so important, we need to look at its historical context. Ridge Racer was a groundbreaking arcade game when it was released towards the end of 1993. It wasn't the first 3D polygonal racing game, but it was far beyond the previous high watermark for the genre, Sega's 1992 arcade hit, Virtua Racing. Virtua Racing made use of Sega's cutting-edge Model 1 hardware to push an unprecedented number of polygons, resulting in a smooth and refined racing experience that far surpassed predecessors like Atari's Hard Drivin' and Namco's own Winning Run. Virtua Racing was a stunning game at the time, but the Model 1 lacked texture mapping support, resulting in a distinctly flat shaded look. Sega's superscalar racing games, such as 1993's Outrunners, based on System 32 hardware, still had some advantages in terms of environmental detail. But Namco's System 22, the hardware behind Ridge Racer, had full texture mapping support, and the results were spectacular. Anyone who saw Ridge Racer in 1993 would have been convinced that it was the future of video games. Namco could build hardware as extravagant as the System 22 because arcade operators were used to paying a lot for a premium arcade cabinet. This mail order ad in the back of the September 1995 issue of coin-op industry magazine Playmeter lists the basic sit-down Ridge Racer arcade cabinet at $7,750 US. At a price point like that, Namco was able to ship hardware far more powerful than even high-end consumer computers. Even with price removed as a limitation though, the System 22 hardware was an incredible feat of engineering. Sega would follow with its Model 2 hardware and direct Ridge Racer competitor, Daytona USA, soon after, but no other arcade game manufacturer came close to this kind of envelope-pushing hardware. So imagine that a little over a year after this incredibly expensive and technologically unprecedented game debuted, a nearly identical version was available at home, running on a little gray box that you can buy at any electronics store for around $400 US. It was nothing short of miraculous. Racing games existed on consoles as well, of course, but prior to Ridge Racer, attempts at a realistic racing game with a behind-the-car or first-person view on consoles usually fell flat. Sega's attempts at recreating their arcade superscalar style on Genesis were middling at best, with games like Ayrton Senna's Super Monaco GP2 offering up choppy but playable facsimiles to the superscalar game's smooth and colorful visuals. A handful of third parties made a solid go at emulating the superscalar style on the Genesis, occasionally with impressive results. Electronic Arts' popular Road Rash series is probably the most successful of these attempts, but the games still struggle mightily to maintain a decent frame rate. A few Genesis racing games even experimented with polygons. Tengen's Race Drive-In port is just barely playable, but it does an admirable job at capturing the look and feel of the arcade original given the hardware. French developer Lancourt developed 2 surprising racing games based on an engine that mixed sprites with flat shaded polygons, Kawasaki Superbike Challenge and F1 World Championship. Kawasaki Superbike Challenge in particular is an impressive feat and a strong candidate for the best polygonal 3D on the stock Genesis, but the lack of music and generally dull gameplay relegated to a novelty. The most impressive Genesis 3D racing game by far, however, is a port of Virtua Racing that uses a special chip, the SVP, or Sega Virtua Processor. The SVP, which was never used in any other game, ballooned the price of Virtua Racing up to a whopping $100 US in 1994, roughly equivalent to $200 in 2023. While it wouldn't ever be mistaken for the arcade version, Virtua Racing on the Genesis maintains a solid frame rate and even includes a 2-player split-screen mode. But it was clear that the Genesis was pushing its limits, even with extra hardware packed into the cartridge. On the SNES side, most racing games relied on Mode 7, the graphics mode that provided hardware-level support for scaling and rotation of a background layer, to provide a simulacrum of realistic racing. Nintendo's own racing games, F-Zero and Super Mario Kart, were perhaps the best examples of this approach. Gremlin's Top Gear series offered a more realistic alternative that used graphical techniques closer to Sega's Superscaler games. But the closest the SNES came to a Ridge Racer-style 3D racing game was 1994's Stunt Race FX, a Nintendo game powered by its Super FX chip. Stunt Race FX has a wider selection of tracks and vehicles than Virtua Racing, but the poor Super FX chip isn't quite up to the task. If you can put up with the poor frame rate and pop-in though, it's quite fun. The newer systems had their own offerings. On the 32X, Sega delivered Virtua Racing Deluxe, a greatly improved home port of Virtua Racing that arrived towards the end of 1994, just a few months after the Genesis port. Virtua Racing Deluxe comes much closer to the arcade in visuals, although the frame rate is still a bit choppy. But Virtua Racing Deluxe makes up for any shortcomings compared to the arcade original by adding bonus content. 2 new tracks and 2 new cars. These extras make Virtua Racing Deluxe worth checking out for Virtua Racing fans, although it's clear that the 32X would have struggled to handle even stripped-down versions of Model 2 games like Daytona USA. The Atari Jaguar's Checkered Flag, another late 1994 release, was clearly created as a direct competitor to Virtua Racing. Developed by Rebellion, the same company that developed the Jaguar standout Alien vs. Predator, Checkered Flag has a baseline level of quality that isn't always guaranteed in Jaguar games. It has a clean look and maintains a steady frame rate. Plus, it has 10 tracks, which is more than most 3D racing games at the time, but it's a horribly boring game. Too many of the tracks look nearly identical, and even the more distinct ones are much blander than Virtua Racing's tracks. The controls are way too touchy, but it doesn't even matter because you'll easily beat the brain-dead AI. This might have had some appeal to desperate Jaguar owners in 1994, but it's not much of a contender compared to the competition. The Sega Saturn would be home to a port of Daytona USA that arrived in Japan in April 1995, and a month later in America with the Saturn's US launch. But at the time of the PlayStation's Japanese launch, the best it had to offer was Gale Racer, a baffling port of the 1990 System 32 game Radmobile. Gale Racer replaces the sprite-based vehicles of the arcade Radmobile with texture-mapped polygonal vehicles, but it's otherwise graphically identical to Radmobile. If Sega had guzzied up a good game, like Power Drift or Outrunners, it might have had some decent counter-programming against Ridge Racer, but Radmobile is one of its worst superscalar racers, notable mostly for featuring the debut of Sonic the Hedgehog as a rear-view mirror ornament. It's the 3DO that provides the first 3D polygonal racer with fully texture-mapped environments to be officially released on home consoles outside of Japan, with 1994's Road and Track presents The Need for Speed. It's an impressive game, with scenic environments and boxy but reasonably nice-looking fully polygonal cars. It's more of a driving simulation than an arcade racing game. You drive through 3 long open-road courses, avoiding traffic and the cops, racing against a single rival. The Need for Speed plays fine, but its main problem is that it's kinda boring. Even the top speed is fairly slow, and the open road tracks are way too long, with a lack of exciting curves and challenges. You're supposedly in one of the fastest sports cars in the world, but it feels more like riding around in a budget sedan in GTA 3. Combined with the lack of in-game music, the overall experience is pleasant, but leaves no real lasting impression. It's understandable why this game received some very positive reviews and was a top seller on the 3DO before the PlayStation was available outside of expensive importers, but without the advantage of a lack of competition, there's little here to recommend. Even a brief comparison quickly demonstrates that Ridge Racer utterly dominates its competition, even the Need for Speed. Ridge Racer is blazingly fast and holds a solid 30 frames per second. Its environments are detailed and varied, with nearly every turn of its track revealing a new sight. The pumping music and overly enthusiastic announcer draw you in. Everything comes together to create a sensory experience that proudly declares that this is it. This is the future. Ridge Racer is essentially just one single track that's well under 90 seconds long, even in its extended form. But this brief loop is all it needs to set the tone for the 5th generation of consoles. But what's most impressive is how Namco built an experience cleverly designed to demonstrate not just that it could provide the vision for the future, but that the PlayStation was the vehicle to deliver it. The first surprise comes right after booting the game, when it opens with a brief playable version of Galaxian while loading before seamlessly fading to the Namco logo. Not only does it provide a bit of extra entertainment in lieu of a stale now loading screen, it also shows just how short loading times can be on the PlayStation. At the time, concerns about loading times on CD-ROM based systems were widespread and not unwarranted. Even the better 3DO games had to frequently stop to load, sometimes for long stretches, and SNK's Neo Geo CD, released in Japan a few months before the PlayStation, was crippled with long loading times due to its single-speed CD-ROM drive. While some PlayStation games suffer from long loading times, it's a problem that's usually associated with poor programming, not a flaw of the console hardware. The Galaxian minigame also holds the first of several secrets. Defeating all of the enemies without dying, a relatively easy feat with a little practice, unlocks a whopping 8 additional cars, bringing the base total up to 12. While these cars don't differ extensively, they have different stats that balance acceleration, handling, top speed, and traction. Ridge Racer's feel is spot on, although it loses a bit when played on the digital D-pad of the PlayStation's original controller. Compared to the feel of a Sega racing game like Daytona USA, Ridge Racer is a bit lighter and floatier, with cars that are more prone to spinning out and bouncing off of walls than flipping out in spectacular crashes. The cars with better traction and handling are relatively easy to guide through the track, with just a few judicious uses of the brake being sufficient to dominate the race, while the faster cars are very sensitive and require careful cornering techniques to avoid constant disaster. The lack of track variety in Ridge Racer is its greatest weakness. Yes, there is only one track, when even the arcade versions of Virtua Racing and Daytona USA had 3, but it's a great one. It packs more sights and memorable curves into a minute than the Need for Speed does in all of its marathon open road tracks. There's skyscrapers, a giant television showing Galaxian, a bridge cutting through a verdant paradise, an idyllic beach, and a helicopter buzzing dangerously close to the track. The 4 courses set the difficulty level, but there are some twists along the way. In addition to amping up the AI car's aggression, each successive course is faster than the last, which is impressive considering that even the beginner mode is faster than most of the racing games at the time. The last 2 courses, High Speed and TT, or Time Trial, add an extension to the track through a construction site with the most challenging corners in the game. Beat all 4 courses, and you'll unlock equivalent extra versions of the courses that reverse the track. But even after you beat the extra versions, there are more secrets left. Turn around at the beginning of a race and smash through the brick wall behind you to race a mirrored version of the track. Or race the time trial again to defeat the elusive black car and unlock it. It's still not a particularly large amount of content, but Ridge Racer manages to make a lot out of a single track. Ridge Racer may be essentially a demo masquerading as a full-price game, but it's one of the best video game demos ever made. It's a compact package that serves as a proof of concept for the PlayStation as a machine that delivers 3D polygonal worlds and brings cutting-edge arcade games into the living room in a way that no video game console was previously capable. There was nothing like it at the time. The PlayStation would soon prove to be capable of even more impressive tricks, but in December 1994, Ridge Racer showed that Sony was going to be a real console contender. Konami was ready for the PlayStation's Japanese launch with the first in what would become a series of deluxe packs. Releases that combined two related arcade games, some of which had never been ported to a home console before. These kinds of archival releases would gain popularity on the PlayStation and Saturn, as these consoles could easily handle arcade games that had to be ported in compromised forms to the 16-bit consoles. The low cost and high storage capacity of CD-ROMs when compared to cartridges also made it quite economical, whereas the ROM size needed for even a compromised 16-bit console port would often push prices into the range of $100 US. The subject of this debut deluxe pack is Parodius, the series of Konami horizontally scrolling shmups that puts a lighthearted and comical spin on the Gradius games. The Parodius series began in 1988 on the MSX computer, a platform that Konami supported almost as heavily as the Famicom. After porting the original Gradius to the MSX under the name Nemesis, Konami created two MSX exclusive Nemesis sequels that are different from the Gradius sequels that debuted in arcades. Despite being designed for the weaker MSX1 hardware, which was very similar to ColecoVision hardware and lacked hardware scrolling support, the Nemesis games played quite well due to Konami's technical mastery of the hardware. Parodius uses the same engine, and it's one of the more impressive MSX1 games, but it still suffers from choppy scrolling and an extremely limited color palette. Parodius must have done quite well on the MSX, because Konami followed it up with an arcade sequel in 1990, Parodius Da. This is the first game on the deluxe pack, but it would probably be the one of less interest to Japanese players in 1994. Parodius Da was very popular and was eventually ported to quite a few platforms, starting just a few months after the arcade release with a 1990 Famicom port that's impressive considering the aging hardware, but is heavily compromised. In 1991, it received further ports to the Game Boy, a platform that quite obviously didn't have the horsepower to handle it, and the Sharp X68000 computer, a platform that was powerful enough for nearly perfect arcade ports, but was far too expensive for most. In 1992, however, versions of Parodius Da arrived on PC Engine and Super Famicom that came much closer to the arcade original. The Super Famicom version in particular comes within inches of arcade perfect. So while the PlayStation version is slightly better, it wouldn't be a huge upgrade for someone used to the Super Famicom version. But if you haven't played Parodius Da before, the PlayStation version is the perfect introduction to one of Konami's best shmup efforts. Parodius Da takes the base of the MSX Parodius and expands it into a game that stands up to the best entries in the Gradius series. You have a choice of 4 characters: the classic Vic Viper from Gradius, an octopus sometimes named Taka, which is just Japanese for octopus, who is something of a series mascot, Twinbee from the Twinbee series, and Pentaru from Antarctic Adventure and a handful of other Konami games. The power-up system is almost identical to Gradius. Collect 1 or more power-ups, then spend them for an upgrade. Each time you collect the power-up, it moves you 1 spot further along a list of power-ups, and cashing in nets you the upgrade in exchange for resetting your power-up meter. There is an additional twist lifted from the Twinbee games. Bells come flying towards you and can be collected for special power-ups. You can tell which power-up you'll get by the color of the bell, and shooting a bell 5 times changes its color. Power-ups acquired through collecting bells can only be used once, so they are quite similar to bombs in other shmups. Bell power-ups are more varied than standard bombs though. For example, collecting a green bell will temporarily turn your ship gigantic and capable of obliterating everything it touches. Parodius Da's subtitle is From Myth to Laughter, a riff on Gradius 3's subtitle, From Legend to Myth. But the game doesn't pull that much else directly from Gradius 3. Several bosses are based on bosses from past Gradius games, and most levels feel like classic Gradius ones. But Parodius Da is a largely original game. Besides its cutesy aesthetic and the addition of the bell system, Parodius Da distinguishes itself from the mainline Gradius games most with its more approachable difficulty curve. This game is not a pushover, especially on higher difficulty levels, but it eases players into the more challenging parts, and it never reaches the hair-pulling difficulty of Gradius 2 or 3. The newer game on the Deluxe Pack is Gokujo Parodius, which debuted in arcades earlier in 1994. Unlike Parodius Da, which ran on fairly modest hardware, Gokujo Parodius used Konami's GX arcade hardware, a 2D powerhouse that far outclassed the 16-bit consoles. While an impressive Super Famicom port arrived in November 1994, just before the Japanese PlayStation launch, it clearly was cut down significantly, although it adds 3 new characters: Goemon, Kid Dracula, and Upa. The PlayStation port on Deluxe Pack unfortunately does not have these additional characters, but it's an otherwise perfect port, save for a bit of extra loading and a touch of slowdown in the most hectic parts. Gokujo Parodius is essentially a supercharged version of Parodius Da. The graphics are technically much improved, but the quality of the artistry really elevates it above its already impressive predecessor. Despite being relatively popular among Western retro gaming fans, no Parodius game has ever received an official American release. This Deluxe Pack did see a release in Europe though, for both the PlayStation and Saturn. This version was simply titled Parodius, and Gokujo Parodius was renamed to Fantastic Journey. A handful of other Parodius games had already hit Europe previously. NES, Game Boy, and SNES versions of Parodius Da received limited releases in Europe, mostly through Konami's Palcom subsidiary. They were usually also released as simply Parodius, although the SNES version carries the subtitle Nonsense Fantasy. Gokujo Parodius Da Deluxe Pack isn't exactly the kind of release that demonstrates the PlayStation's power, but it collects 2 immensely enjoyable games at a relatively affordable price. Compared to a lot of the other releases in the first wave of PlayStation titles, it's aged remarkably well, as the sprite work is still top-notch and the gameplay holds up perfectly. Tama, Adventurous Ball and Giddy Labyrinth, is a simple maze game in which you guide a ball to its goal. Inspired by the classic wooden labyrinth toy, you tilt the playing field to manipulate the ball rather than controlling it directly. It's not a bad idea for an attempt at an early 3D game, directly translating a familiar and simple toy from the real world that was difficult to reproduce in a 2D video game. Like many early 3D games though, Tama stumbles in its execution. Developed and published by Time Warner Interactive, Tama is one of two PlayStation Japanese launch titles that were also Sega Saturn Japanese launch titles, although it seems to be more closely associated with the Saturn than the PlayStation. Perhaps because the Saturn's arrival the week prior to the PlayStation meant that the game technically debuted on that system. Tama is probably best known specifically for being a launch title. Game magazines, desperate for coverage of any Saturn or PlayStation game prior to launch, gave the game quite a bit of attention, with EGM dedicating a full page to it in a February 1995 special feature on the systems right after their Japanese debuts. Tama literally means ball, or sphere in Japanese. As with a lot of Japanese words, it also has a few other possible meanings, such as a soul or spirit, or perhaps more fittingly given the quality of the game, balls as in testicles. The story is vague and threadbare, but the game's protagonist, a ball also conveniently named Tama, is saving the world by defeating the villain Akudama. This is another one of those clever Japanese puns, as Akudama literally translates to something like bad guy, and Dama is an alternative voicing of Tama. Tama is quite obviously a very early 3D game. Many objects are flat shaded, and the surfaces that are texture mapped used very simple textures. Animations are minimal. There is some movement on the ball to simulate it rolling, but it appears to be a 2D animation, even continuing when the ball is at rest. A few other traps strewn about the courses have a small bit of animation when triggered, like a spring that will send your ball careening in the opposite direction. In one of the game's small quirky touches, a cow appears in a few stages, apparently as an homage to the cow in Hard Drivin', but it's not animated and simply slides around. The game maintains a decent frame rate, but in every other way it's a mess that looks like it's constantly on the verge of falling apart. Objects clip and disappear with the slightest change in camera angle. Polygons barely hold together. The default view is too zoomed out to see anything, but the playfield is often an unreadable mess even when zoomed in. The constant tilting and rotating of the playfield that's required to maneuver the ball is also frequently at odds with the camera. It's incredibly easy to place the camera in a position where the ball is no longer visible. Even setting aside the graphical jank and an uncooperative camera, Tama has serious gameplay issues. The ball's reactions to your movements are agonizingly slow. You have to plan a course for the ball in advance, and even then, the ball can go careening off the edge of the stage or even unexpectedly clip through a boundary to fall to its doom. It's manageable in the early stages, but later on you have to contend with a plethora of obstacles that Tama's shitty controls are not equipped to deal with. Among the most frustrating challenges you'll encounter are these moving pits strewn about the later stages that your ball can fall into, causing it to respawn. But due to poor collision and a lack of iframes after respawning, the ball can fall into them repeatedly. The moving platforms that appear in a handful of stages are even worse. They move at a glacial pace, and if you fall off one, the ball respawns at the previous platform. This is particularly egregious on one of the final stages that's composed nearly entirely of a series of moving platforms. If your ball falls off of one platform, your ball will be respawned on the previous platform. But it's easy to immediately fall off a moving platform after respawning, and it doesn't take much to erase all of your progress. I eventually got through this one due to the game's bugginess, by clipping through to the goal. All of these problems are further compounded by the game's timer, which places a completely unnecessary sense of arcade pressure on a game that's barely functional. The timer resets at the start of each world, but time carries over between stages in the world, with a bit of extra time added after completing a stage, in much the same way as arcade racing games add time onto their timers at checkpoints. Wrestling with the camera, controls, and poor design choices while the timer ticks down turns what could have been a serene puzzle game into a frustrating scramble to the goal. While it's a bad design decision, the timer is the strongest hint of how Tama began life. Tama's developer and publisher, Time Warner Interactive, was previously the Japanese division of Tengen, which in turn was the console publishing subsidiary of Atari Games, the arcade-focused company spun off from Atari Inc. Tengen had a small development team in Japan that did a handful of original games and some ports, including the Japanese Mega Drive version of Marble Madness. Unlike the poorly received version of Marble Madness released by Electronic Arts for the Genesis in America and the Mega Drive in Europe, the port by Tengen's Japanese team is an accurate recreation of the arcade original. The lead programmer and project lead on the Japanese Mega Drive version of Marble Madness was Jun Amanai, who was also credited as project lead on Tama. In fact, nearly every developer credited on the Japanese Mega Drive version of Marble Madness also worked on Tama. Even though Marble Madness plays differently than Tama, with the player controlling the ball directly rather than tilting the playfield, it's almost certain that Tama was directly inspired by the team's work porting Marble Madness. It's possible that Tama was even originally conceived as a 3D update of Marble Madness, although there's nothing on record from Amanai or any of the other team members confirming or denying it. Tama is not without its charms. The soundtrack, which seems to consciously evoke Isao Tamata's Debussy arrangements on Snowflakes or Dancing, is a treat. And in the brief moments when the gameplay gels on one of the better designed stages, you can see the shape of a good game hidden under its flawed surface. The development team was certainly quite accomplished as well, given their work on the excellent Mega Drive conversions of Marble Madness and Grindstormer. On his YouTube page, Amanai has even shared footage of several unreleased PC Engine games, including an impressive port of Marble Madness and even ports of other Atari arcade games such as Peter Pack-Rat and Off the Wall. But the combination of a lack of experience with 3D and a deadline to hit the Saturn and PlayStation launches meant that the game did not get the polish it needed. The only reason to play Tama today is if you want to explore the history of early PlayStation games. It's certainly the most unique game among the PlayStation's launch lineup, but if you bought this instead of Ridge Racer in December 1994, you'd be sorely disappointed. A4 Evolution, Elisha de Ico 4, is a PlayStation port of what was then the most recent entry in ArtThink's A-Train series of business management sims. The A-Train series dates back to 1985, when the initial entry, Elisha de Ico, or Let's Go by A-Train, debuted on popular Japanese computers of the time, such as the FM7 and PC-88. Eventually, the A-Train series made its way to consoles such as the Famicom and PC Engine CD-ROM. Later entries were even localized and released on Western computer platforms such as the Commodore Amiga and MS-DOS. The A-Train series started as a simulation strictly of the railroad business, but by the time of A4 Evolution, it had expanded to include managing buses, property, and even stock market investments. It's a capitalism simulator, baby! A Western localization of this game for DOS even renamed it to CEO, and added a goofy frame story where you take over a company after its CEO, played by veteran actor James Coburn, mysteriously disappears. It would be easy to dismiss a game that thrusts you into the role of a ruthless capitalist min-maxing profit with zero care for the ordinary people's lives that are affected. But ArtThink plays it so straight-faced that it practically rolls over into parody. It's hard to tell to what extent this is meant to be taken seriously. But even if you find the idea of capital B business in the real world immoral or just plain boring, the sandbox appeal of A-Train and its gentle atmosphere of trains and buses slowly rolling along their paths to relaxing jazzy tunes can be quite enticing. One of the new features in this PlayStation version is a 3D rendered ride on any train or bus line, further adding to the game's meditative appeal. A4 Evolution's only big problem is that it's not in English. While it's possible to brute force your way through menus and get some basic understanding of how to play the game, it's far too complex to thrive on guesswork alone. Thankfully, an updated version of A4 Evolution, called A4 Evolution Global in Japan, was released as simply A-Train in North America. We'll cover that one in detail when we get there. But before then, we'll see another game from ArtThink that's unlike almost any game that had ever come before. Mahjong Goku Tenjiku is the first of many Mahjong games that we will see on the PlayStation. It's not even the only Mahjong game released for the PlayStation at launch. With 2 Mahjong games among its 8 Japanese launch titles, the PlayStation's initial library was comprised of 25% Mahjong. Mahjong Goku Tenjiku is a specific variant of Mahjong called Riichi Mahjong. Riichi Mahjong is a Japanese variant on the original Chinese Mahjong, and it's not just the most popular form of Mahjong in Japan, it's the most popular table game in Japan, period. It's typically a 4-player game, although it's not uncommon to find 2-player variations in video games. At its core, Mahjong is similar to various rummy card games, except it's played with Mahjong tiles instead of cards. The goal is to make a winning hand composed of matches, usually 3 or 4 of the same tile, or a sequential run of 3 tiles from the same suit. Every turn, a player will draw a tile from the pile and discard a tile. The most straightforward strategy to build a winning hand is usually to make good use of the initial tiles you're dealt, plus make smart decisions in the tiles you draw and discard, although more advanced strategies involve stealing tiles that your opponents discard. If you only need 1 more tile for a winning hand, you can declare Riichi. To clinch victory, you need to either draw the winning tile you need, which is called Sumo, or pull a tile discarded by one of your opponents, which is called Ran. You can also form matches throughout play by pulling your opponent's discarded tiles even if you haven't declared Riichi. But this approach comes with some drawbacks. Once you form these matches, or melds, the tiles are revealed to your opponent, and the size of your active hand is reduced by the matched tiles for the duration of the round. But if you do start forming these melds by pulling discards, you can no longer declare Riichi. Instead, you need to win through fulfilling some other condition. These conditions are called Yaku. Declaring Riichi is considered a Yaku, so additional conditions are not necessary when trying to win through that route. Understanding the other Yaku and how they can be achieved to your benefit is where Mahjong starts to get tricky. There are quite a few different rules and variations, some quite complex, that affect how Yaku are fulfilled. My own experience with Mahjong has largely been limited to the Yakuza games. I can handle the basics, but I can't claim to be very good at it. Even at its simplest, playing Mahjong well is difficult. You'll think you have a good hand going, only to be blindsided by your opponent forming a winning hand based on some Yaku you had no idea about. As for Mahjong Goku Tenjiku, it's surprisingly similar to playing Mahjong in Yakuza, except there are many additional rules that can be set to customize play. These rules are presented entirely in kanji that I can't read, so I'm not really sure what most of them do. Thankfully, it's relatively easy to get into otherwise, although there's a lack of English translation for the tiles, many of which can only be identified by the kanji written on them. Beyond that, Mahjong Goku Tenjiku is just about the most bare-bones Mahjong game possible. You can either choose a story mode with a series of Mahjong matches, or go directly into a quick single game. The graphics are just simple 2D pixel art tiles in the green background. The only thing that makes Mahjong Goku Tenjiku stand out in any way is its theming. It's based on the widely influential Chinese novel Journey to the West, which has served as the basis of everything from Dragon Ball to everyone's favorite Famicom Kusoge, Super Monkey Daiboken. If there are two things that are consistently popular in Japan, it's Mahjong and Journey to the West. Mahjong Goku Tenjiku is actually the third entry in a series of Mahjong / Journey to the West crossovers. All of them by Chat Noir, a developer that seems to specialize in Mahjong games. The first game in the series, Professional Mahjong Goku, hit the Famicom Disk System in 1986, and eventually made its way to a slew of Japanese computers. Mahjong Goku Tenjiku initially appeared on the 3DO and Super Famicom, before becoming a launch title for the PlayStation and Saturn. It was also ported to the PC-98 and even the PC-FX. So Mahjong Goku Tenjiku is a solid, but not particularly notable Mahjong game, although it clearly has some enduring popularity in Japan.
Eat!
Mahjong Station Mazen is the second Mahjong game in the PlayStation's Japanese launch lineup. It plays nearly identically to Mahjong Goku Tenjiku, but it's more ambitious in terms of presentation. Whereas Mahjong Goku Tenjiku is presented entirely in 2D art that could have easily been done on any 16-bit console, Mahjong Station Mazen makes the leap into 3D, with the table, tiles, and even your player and opponents rendered in full polygonal glory. Although it was published by Sunsoft, Mahjong Station Mazen's development was a joint effort between Sunsoft and Chat Noir, the developer of Mahjong Goku Tenjiku. While details in the game's development are nearly non-existent, it seems most likely that Sunsoft provided the 3D engine, while Chat Noir handled the Mahjong end. The 3D graphics are quite decent given that this is a launch title. Mahjong Station Mazen is the only game in the PlayStation's Japanese launch lineup that makes a serious attempt at rendering humans in 3D, and they're quite detailed. Your opponents are animated and throw down Mahjong tiles with vigor, usually accompanied with an enthusiastic bark. You can even see the individual fingers on your player's hand impatiently tapping on the table while you ponder your next move. As a Mahjong game, Mahjong Station Mazen is quite playable in its 3D mode, but the novelty quickly wears off. The animations slow down the game considerably, and while the camera is controllable to a certain degree, it's not as easy to read as a 2D top-down view. Thankfully, Mahjong Station Mazen includes a standard mode that looks like a slightly nicer version of Mahjong Goku Tenjiku. Mahjong Station Mazen's AI is also a little easier than Mahjong Goku Tenjiku, which is a good thing since Mahjong Goku Tenjiku can be punishing if you're a less experienced Mahjong player. Mahjong Station Mazen seems to be fairly obscure in Japan. While it had two budget re-releases, one is part of the Sunsoft Best Collection, and another is part of the Value 1500 series, it doesn't even have a Japanese Wikipedia page. so this probably isn't worth checking out given the many other, better Mahjong options at your disposal, but the 3D mode is an admirable attempt at doing something novel with the usually staid Mahjong genre. If the PlayStation's debut lineup can be divided into games that point towards the future and ones that slap a new coat of paint on the past, Nekketsu Oyako is definitely in the latter camp. It's a bog-standard 2D belt-scrolling beat-em-up, one that feels a bit dated even when compared to its contemporaries, which were expanding the genre with RPG elements and in-depth combat engines. Beat-em-ups were already on the decline by the PlayStation's December 1994 debut, first ceding ground to one-on-one fighters like Street Fighter II in arcades, then on consoles as the fighting game craze arrived at home. Only a handful of 2D beat-em-ups would eventually appear on the PlayStation, many of them ports of older arcade games that didn't have accurate home conversions on 16-bit consoles. Nekketsu Oyako is part of an even smaller circle of 2D beat-em-ups on PlayStation that were originals rather than arcade ports. Developed and published by Technosoft, Nekketsu Oyako's name translates to Hot-Blooded Family, which is usually how it was referred to in Western magazines at the time. Despite the naming similarities, it has no relation to the Kunio-kun series of games, which also often featured Nekketsu in their titles. Technosoft's specialty throughout the 16-bit years was shmups, particularly the Thunder Force series, which culminated in the excellent Lightning Force, sometimes known as Thunder Force 4. Technosoft also developed the Genesis cult classic Herzog Zwei, an early entry in the real-time strategy genre. But Nekketsu Oyako is Technosoft's first and only attempt at a beat-em-up. It's a competent first effort, although the lack of experience with the genre sometimes shows. The story of Nekketsu Oyako is about as basic as they come. Saeko Hibino is a genius scientist who graduated from MIT at the age of 12, and won a Nobel Peace Prize at 17. She's kidnapped by an evil organization, Halagulu Dan, thus forcing her to build a doomsday device. Saeko's husband Rando, a gym teacher / professional wrestler, sets off to rescue her, along with their daughter Rio and Saeko's teenage assistant Tora. The three characters break down about how you expect. Rando, who is almost actionably a Mike Hager clone, is the heavy with the strongest attacks and the slowest speed. Leo is fast but weak and wields a versatile hammer as her main weapon. Tora is a balanced character in the vein of Cody from Final Fight or Axel from Streets of Rage. He also carries around this lightsaber thing that he occasionally pulls out for special moves, but he mostly relies on his fists. Like a lot of beat-em-ups of this era, Nekketsu Oyako expands on the basic kick and punch moveset, adding dashing, and a single-button special move that trades health for causing a considerable amount of damage to anything in your path. There's also a powerful quarter-circle forward attack, variations in attacks when combined with dashing, and a wide variety of weapons, including firearms. Perhaps the most unique addition is a double jump, which can be combined with attacking for some ridiculous air combos. Very helpful against some of the flying enemies later in the game. There are a few other small details that have a relatively small effect on gameplay. As with most other beat-em-ups, there are health pickups in the form of food and beverages. A few times in the game, there's a beer can pickup, which can only be used by Lando. If Rio or Tora, who are 16 and 17 respectively, try to pick up the beer can, a big adults only message appears. Lando is also the only character who can use the bazooka weapon, although he can't use any other firearms. Since the bazooka only shows up a few times, and the other firearms are relatively common, Lando's benefits don't really outweigh his limitations, although he's probably the best overall character in the game as far as moveset goes. When it comes down to actual gameplay execution, Nekketsu Oyako gets the job done, but doesn't distinguish itself from its 16-bit console peers, and definitely pales compared to contemporary arcade beat-em-ups. It can feel a little sluggish at times, and you can't cancel out of the quarter circle forward move, which can be frustrating since it takes a while to finish. It's perfectly playable, but doesn't exactly convey a next-generation experience. When compared against other 1994 beat-em-ups, like Streets of Rage 3 on the Genesis, and Capcom's Dungeons & Dragons Tower of Doom for its 16-bit CPS2 system in arcades, it falls short. Where Nekketsu Oyako does excel is in its subtly surreal humor and occasionally inspired art design. The first stage is titled Mega Tokyo 2064, and it's a typical beat-em-up opening jaunt, starting on a suburban street before progressing to more urban areas. It's here where we encounter the first of many references to Big Black. It seems like this is an alternate name for Haragurudan, the organization of evildoers we're fighting, but mostly it just made me wonder if someone on the development team was a big fan of Steve Albini. The stage concludes with a confrontation with the first boss in the bridge while a helicopter flies in the background, occasionally spraying bullets. But once you defeat the boss, the bridge starts to collapse, leaving you to fall into the waiting mouth of a whale? The second stage mostly takes place inside of said whale, which is definitely a unique setting for a beat-em-up, even if the background is boring and repetitive. It also introduces some weird enemies, like these blobby boys made out of water, and walking cephalopods with boxing gloves. After a boss fight on top of the whale, you arrive on Hero Gra Island, an amusement park complete with a roller coaster that you ride while fighting off hordes of enemies. The final section takes place in a lava-filled underground cavern. The last two stages are less inspired. The fourth stage, Sky Gaia, takes place on some kind of floating sky island, which is a cool idea, but it's visually bland, with generic indoor and outdoor areas lined with Greco-Roman columns, and a lame mountain background that looks like it's a poorly digitized photograph. The final stage takes place in Haragurudan headquarters, which mixes some generic office decor with traditional Japanese theming. It's in this final stage where I finally started to tire of Nekketsu Oyako's shit. It's broken into 5 areas, the first 4 concluding in rematches with the previous stage's bosses. The rematches are preceded by either waves of the same old nuke enemies from earlier stages, or obnoxious obstacles like spiked balls swinging on chains. Even when you finally reach the final boss, he sends waves of enemies at you before taking you on himself. With their poor AI, all these enemies can do is form a giant blob that surrounds you and gets in a bunch of cheap hits before you can fend them off. Nekketsu Oyako isn't really a particularly difficult game, and it's generous with health power-ups, lives, and continues, so this really is more annoying than anything else. But this extended endurance test wore down my goodwill towards the game. Once you finally square off against the last boss, he has 2 forms. The first is a gun-toting mobster in a ridiculously oversized suit. Then the second, bizarrely enough, is a cape-wearing superhero. He has a lot of cheap moves, but he can be cheesed pretty easily with a little patience. Then you'll be greeted with a brief ending as you escape with Saeko, capped up a scene of post-rescue domestic life, as Orlando puts on his suit to go to work while Rio gets ready for school, anime cliche toast hanging from her mouth. Neketsu Oyako doesn't even have a credits roll, so not that much is known about who at Technosoft actually worked on it. Twitter user Yuzawara, apparently a former Technosoft employee, has shared a few details. At one point, Neketsu Oyako was seriously considered for arcade release. There were location tests, and Yuzawara shared scans of the instruction cards for the cabinet. It's not clear if this was still PlayStation-based hardware, or perhaps something like Technosoft's custom TEC 442A hardware, which powered its 1993 shmup, Hyperduel. Yuzawara also revealed that Neketsu Oyako's premise evolved quite a bit through development, and an earlier version had Saeko as the final boss. If you picked up Neketsu Oyako with a PlayStation on its Japanese launch in 1994, you'd probably be satisfied with a decent but not particularly distinguished beat-em-up that might be a fun break in between rounds of Bridge Racer. These days, it's probably not worth playing when there are so many better beat-em-up alternatives. It apparently did well enough for Technosoft to port it to the Saturn a few months later with some minor refinements, but it's largely forgotten today for a reason. Crime Crackers is by far the most ambitious game in the PlayStation's Japanese launch lineup. Sure, its polygonal graphics aren't quite as impressive as Ridge Racer's, but its mix of first-person exploration, squad-based real-time combat, light RPG elements, and narrative world-building across a roughly 10 to 15 hour adventure puts it in a different class from its fellow launch games in every other way. It even succeeds at mixing its disparate influences into something that's accessible and approachable, despite there being almost no game before or since that plays quite like it. But some serious balance issues and tortuously long and repetitive level design make Crime Crackers a game that's better appreciated as a historical curiosity, rather than something worth playing. While it's seldom mentioned in Western coverage of the game, Crime Crackers is based on the manga Sho Hikari Seikai Star Crackers, our super light century star crackers, written by the mononymous mangaka Kokomahi. It's a fairly obscure manga outside of its association with Crime Crackers. There's virtually nothing on the English internet about it, and it doesn't even have its own Japanese Wikipedia page. But the premise is tailor-made for a video game, a trope-heavy sci-fi future in which the Galactica Police are unable to handle an epidemic of space piracy, leaving the real dirty work up to bounty hunters. You lead a team of such bounty hunters, Pink Dolphin. The basic flow of the game alternates between story sequences, presented primarily through text boxes and still images, and gameplay sequences. The gameplay is separated into standalone stages, of which there are 16. Each stage is fairly linear in progression, usually involving tracking down key items such as ID cards to unlock the next part of the stage until you finally reach the boss. Although a few mix things up a bit by introducing time limits and puzzles. Between stages, you'll also have a chance to purchase items and equipment to upgrade your characters, although you're limited to purchasing equipment based on your team's rank, which progresses in typical Japanese letter grading style from E to SS. While it may look at first glance as though Crime Crackers is an early Japanese attempt at an FPS in the style of contemporaries such as Synergy's Iron Angel of the Apocalypse or 3DO, it's really more of an old-school dungeon crawler at heart. More specifically, Crimecrackers is a riff on the real-time blobber subgenre of dungeon crawlers, pioneered by FTL Games' Dungeon Master from 1987, and Westward's 1991 hit Eye of the Beholder, both of which made their way to Japan via computer and console ports. These games built on popular predecessors such as the Wizardry series, which introduced the blobber style of dungeon crawlers that simplified party management by treating a multi-character party traversing a dungeon as a blob, occupying a single tile. The innovation of Dungeon Master was taking this blobber style and making it even more player-friendly by adding a real-time combat system, usually mouse-driven via cursor. Crimecrackers takes this idea and boils it down to its barest essence. You control a predefined party of 3 characters: team leader and mechanical genius, Amelia, sword-wielding fox girl, Lisa, and swole dragon dude, Duran. Individual characters do not gain levels or have any customization options. The team ranking, determined by the unfortunately named Cracker Points, is the primary way by which your team gains power, and it's mostly a means to unlock new and more powerful weapons and armor. There are also special character-specific items hidden throughout the stages, such as apples that increase Amelia's HP, and upgrades to increase the capacity of gun energy, a shared pool of ammunition. A handful of other equipable accessories that provide buffs or special abilities like night vision can also be found or bought. In the moment-to-moment gameplay, you control one character at a time, with the other characters flanking you on either side. Changing characters is as simple as pressing the select button. Once you get a few stages into the game, you'll figure out the basic strategy. Duran is powerful and can also take the most damage, but uses the most gun energy when attacking, making him ideal for boss encounters. Lisa's sword is powerful, but she can't take as much damage. She doesn't use any gun energy though, which becomes important later on when gun energy refills become scarce. Amelia is fairly weak in both attack and defense, although she shoots faster than Duran, and can equip some special items that Duran and Lisa cannot. The actual controls are pretty awkward. Basic movement is similar to how Wolfenstein 3D or Doom control in their respective console ports. The D-pad moves forwards and backwards and controls rotation, while you can strafe with either set of shoulder buttons. Pressing left and right shoulder buttons together guards, which can fully block many enemy attacks, although it's not always effective, especially in later stages. The triangle button brings up the menu for managing your characters and inventory, as well as viewing the map once you acquire the auto-mapping item. The circle button does double duty as a generic context-sensitive interact button, as well as initiating a limited-use special attack. This mostly works well since the special attack can only be used when there are enemies nearby, but it can be frustrating to waste these special attacks, which are best saved for bosses. Crimecrackers falters when it comes to combat. You cannot simply press an attack button. You need to first press the square button to bring up the crosshairs. This changes the controls so that the D-pad now moves the crosshairs. Pressing the square button attacks, and pressing the cross button exits back to standard movement controls. You still have limited movement in this combat mode, either by strafing with the shoulder buttons, or slowly dragging the crosshairs to the edge of the screen. While the combat is never especially challenging once you get a handle on how it works, it is at best a chore and at worst an exercise in tedium. Enemies frequently attack with projectiles, and even if you manage to guard to avoid damage, you'll still get knocked back. Furthermore, gun energy refills are your tightest resource through much of the game, and unlike health restoratives, they can't be purchased between stages. So the winning strategy through many stages is to rely on Lisa's sword attacks, since they don't use gun energy. Some combination of guarding and circle strafing usually does the trick, but in the tight corridors that comprise much of the game, there isn't much in the way of combat strategy other than brute forcing your way through. The level designs start off relatively manageable in early stages before expanding to sprawling, repetitive monstrosities in the back half. Myriad identical rooms are connected by identical corridors, populated with the same endless parade of enemies that will wear your patience down. A lack of landmarks makes it nearly impossible to navigate through these layouts without getting lost, frustrated, and eventually just bored. There is an auto-mapping item that you can pick up in the first stage or purchase if you miss it, but it's woefully inadequate. Its main problem is that it doesn't show walls, which means you cannot tell which areas you've explored fully versus the ones with an unexplored passageway. The good news is that most enemies don't regenerate, and the game is fairly generous with resources as long as you're thorough in exploring the levels and exercise a bit of restraint in using gun energy. All but the most powerful health restoratives can be bought cheaply, so keeping your characters healed up usually isn't a problem. But later stages are tedious and lazily designed, with the final stage essentially amounting to wandering aimlessly around a large open area until you hit a tile with an invisible teleporter that takes you to the final boss. Crime Crackers presents some pretty impressive visuals for a Japanese launch PlayStation game. While the environmental textures are repetitive and the engine is limited to the flat, tile-based layouts of standard dungeon crawlers, it's smooth in motion. Most enemies are fully polygonal and well animated. The character designs also have a very mid-90s anime OVA appeal that's undeniably charming. The music, composed by Noriyuki Asakura, may be the highlight of the game, with live instrumentation lending a surprising depth and warmth to a largely atmospheric score, punctuated by a few poppier tunes. Strangely though, the music is not consistent throughout the gameplay segments, often dropping out for a time, leaving you in near silence other than the minimal sound effects. Crime Crackers was the debut game of Media Vision Entertainment, a company founded in 1993 by Takashi Fukushima, a former member of Nihon Telnet's Riot subsidiary. Media Vision had several other ex-Riot employees on staff, primarily ones that, like Fukushima, worked on Riot's PC Engine CD-ROM titles. Fukushima and Akifumi Kaneko, one of the two game designers credited on Crime Crackers, also worked on the first two games in the Tenshi no Uta series. Workmen-like JRPGs that harness the PC Engine CD-ROM's multimedia capabilities to elevate what is otherwise a fairly standard Dragon Quest clone. They also worked on several other games that are among the better examples of the Nihon Telnet style of mixing anime sex appeal with shameless genre ripoffs, such as the Bubble Bobble clone, Poppin' Magic. Media Vision's roots in PC Engine CD-ROM development make a lot of sense when examining Crime Crackers in detail. Even the story sequences, while lacking the flashiness of the best PC Engine CD-ROM cutscenes, feel heavily indebted to them stylistically. Many PC Engine CD-ROM games also favored narrative progression and character development over gameplay depth and character customization, something that Crime Crackers seems to have inherited from the Nihon Telnet house style in particular. Fukushima recently spoke with Famitsu for Media Vision's upcoming 30th anniversary and revealed a few details about Crime Crackers' development. Development on the game started Golden Week in 1994, a week of Japanese holidays that runs from April 29th through the first week of May, which means that there were only around 7 months from the start of development to when the game appeared on store shelves. This definitely explains why Crime Crackers feels so rushed, especially in the cut-and-paste design of its later stages. Fukushima also revealed in this interview that he decided to base the game on Super Light Century Star Crackers due to his friendship with Kokomahi, and because working from an existing scenario made it easier to develop the game on such an abbreviated timeline. Crime Crackers is not without its charms, and it's an impressive debut effort from Media Vision considering that it was made on a tight schedule working with new hardware. But it's simply not a game worth playing in 2023. The music and early 32-bit visuals have some aesthetic charm, but they aren't enough to outweigh the repetitive, shallow, and frequently frustrating gameplay. It's also a bit of a challenge to work through without Japanese language skills. I had to rely on a video walkthrough from YouTube games reviewer Stolkin to get past a few particularly language-heavy bits. There is a sequel to Crime Crackers that was released in 1997, but we'll be seeing more of Media Vision before then, including a very different kind of game just a few episodes from now. Well, that's all for the debut episode of the PlayStation Experiment. I hope you enjoyed this look at the origins of the Sony PlayStation and its Japanese launch lineup. The next episode is shaping up to be a real doozy. We'll be taking a look at the Japanese launch of the PlayStation's first major rival, the Sega Saturn, as well as the rest of the PlayStation's December 1994 releases. There's a really great lineup of games, folks, including 2 more from Konami, debuts from what would become 2 of the most highly respected game development studios in the world, and the legendary Kusoge. I'm pretty excited to dig into these. For all the latest updates and news, you can follow me on Twitter. Our co-host is Family Consumer. Thanks for watching!